Jesus says nothing's impossible with God. Does that mean that there's literally nothing that we can conceive of that God cannot do? No. As a matter of fact, as I'll show you here in a second, the Bible actually does give us a few examples of things that God cannot do. Well, how is it possible then that there's things that God can't do, and yet Jesus says nothing's impossible with God? Well, again, context matters. Let me give you a few examples of what I'm talking about. When we say nothing's impossible with God, when Jesus says nothing's impossible with God, he's not referring to things that are logically impossible or things that are inconsistent with God's unchangeable character. All right. For instance, can God make a square circle? Can God make a married bachelor? These are questions we can ask in the sense that those are words that we have strung together into a proper grammatical sentence, but they don't really mean anything. They're still nonsense, all right? What is the definition of a bachelor? It's an unmarried man, right? So does it make any logical sense to have a married bachelor? See, to say that it's impossible for God to make a married bachelor is not the same thing as saying, well, it's impossible to fit a camel through the eye of a needle. That one is a matter of physical impossibility. We think of it as physically impossible for something as large as a camel to fit through an opening as small as the size of a needle, all right? Whereas the other is definitionally impossible. Literally, the meanings of the words make it so that it's just a nonsense statement to say a married bachelor. So when we say nothing's impossible with God, we don't say that he can do these types of nonsense things. Another thing that, I also mentioned that God cannot do things that are inconsistent with his immutable, his unchangeable character. For example, here's a passage from Hebrews chapter 6, verse 18. It says, God did this so that by two unchangeable things in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled to take hold of the hope set before us may be greatly encouraged. It is impossible for God to lie. Well, wait a minute, Ken. I thought Jesus said that nothing's impossible for God, and then this says it's impossible for God to lie. Well, to say that God could lie is basically the logical equivalent of saying that God could make a square circle. Here's why. God is truth, all right? He is the ultimate source of truth. To say something is true, meaning if we say something is true, we look to God, whether we realize it or not. This is what we're doing. We're basically looking to God and to his truth to determine whether or not it is true. All truth is determined by him. Just like goodness is determined by him. When you say something is good, all right, you may not realize that you're doing this or not, but when you say something is a good thing, what you're saying is it resembles this character trait in God that we call goodness. And the more something is different from that character trait in God, that's when we start to call it evil, right? Goodness is approaching God. Evil is going away from God. Truth is approaching God. Untruth, falsehood is going away from God. He is the source that provides meaning to those terms. So if he is the source that provides meaning, then it's another nonsense kind of statement to say that he's the opposite of that. So to say that, can God lie? It's like saying, can the source of all truth say something that's not true? Or can the source of all truth be untrue? Well, no, because by definition of being the source of all truth, he can't be untrue. He can't be false, all right? Same thing. Can the source of all goodness be evil? Well, no, because he is the source of what goodness means in the first place. So, can God commit evil? That's a nonsense statement.